Thank you, Leon. Can you just confirm that I'm sharing the screen and you can see everything? All right.
Looks good.
Perfect. Thank you. So we'll continue today with a very similar presentation now for adaptation planning, where many of the concepts for mitigation also come to play in terms of data collection, prioritizing response measures, also financing as well, and as well as mainstreaming and alignment. But we'll focus the presentation on the NAP process, or the National Adaptation Plan process, which is this international framework that orients how countries can actually prepare, implement, monitor, report, verify, and also update their adaptation planning processes. We'll take a deep dive into some key considerations for adaptation planning to keep in mind under the NAP process, and finally look at the alignment between adaptation, sustainability, and disaster risk, which was in fact one of the questions that were raised earlier on today. So jumping right in with the introduction, we can see that the Paris Agreement aims to also strengthen the goal of climate change response by increasing the ability of all to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and to foster climate resilience. So in this case, as part of the Paris Agreement, defines a global goal on adaptation. First of all, to enhance adaptive capacity and resilience, and second is to reduce vulnerability with a view to contributing to sustainable development. Now, while the Paris Agreement seeks to hold global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, it's regardless projected that the resulting climate change from these temperature increases, albeit held or capped over time, these changes will still inflict significant impact to socioeconomic and environmental system, for which the Paris Agreement also seeks to ensure adequate adaptation response is taken in light of these changes in climate. Now, under the Paris Agreement, all parties shall engage in adaptation planning and implementation. This means shall, so it's mandatory. And this planning and implementation for adaptation can be taken place through, for example, national adaptation plans, vulnerability assessments, monitoring and evaluation, and economic diversification. Now, all parties should report on the process of adaptation, vulnerabilities, and the progress of adaptation responses, particularly through adaptation communications. Now, parties should report this information, so it is not mandatory, but reporting information on climate impacts, vulnerabilities, adaptation measures, progress, and support needed and received has several advantages. And this includes fostering accountability and trust, but also elevating the priorities of adaptation in line with mitigation, and also helps to foster acquisition of funding and of support to better implement adaptation actions as required or as identified and prioritized by the country. So keeping this in mind of the role of adaptation within the Paris Agreement, we can see in this next graphic how the adaptation planning process comes about. So the innermost circle, which is in darker blue, showcases the 4 technical steps for adaptation. The first step is assessing the impacts and vulnerabilities of climate change in order to identify at-risk populations, at-risk geographic areas, vulnerable sectors, or particular activities that would be impacted by climate change. And so these vulnerability and risk assessments are fundamental to build a knowledge base of what the problem is, such that adequate response can then be undertaken under step 2, which is planning adaptation action. That is, identifying an array of possible measures and to prioritize the most appropriate ones according to local circumstances. And the selection and prioritization of most adequate adaptation measures should consider many factors such as technical feasibility, the urgency of action, and the resources needed for implementation versus those that are actually available already, and also the alignment of adaptation, as we looked earlier this morning, with the sectoral and national development goals. Once these plans are in place, then the third step consists of actually implementing adaptation through the mobilization of policies and programs, the development and implementation of projects, and also, of course, the mobilization of resources. These include human resources, financial resources, and also technical resources. And lastly, the fourth step here is monitoring and evaluating adaptation, or M&E. And M&E is fundamental to assess how adaptation measures are progressing with respect to the targets that have been set, to assess how adaptation is contributing to reducing vulnerability and building resilience against climate change, and also to identify which areas need further intervention. So really, M&E, or monitoring and evaluation, is critical, as we often say that we can only manage what we measure. So the results from M&E, which is linked to the National Transparency System in Trinidad and Tobago, establishes this continuous improvement framework that can then provide the information for decision makers to begin the cycle once again for enhanced adaptation planning. Now, the outermost circle of this image showcases the enabling factors for adaptation planning. So first of all, engaging a wide range of stakeholders, and once they're engaged, raising this awareness and ambition among all stakeholders so that they can participate in adaptation planning and implementation processes. Also, providing sufficient space for decision makers within the political realm to make sure they understand and take an active role in adaptation planning. And this is enabled by sharing the information that's necessary and providing enough capacity building in terms of technical capacities, or enough access to resources, and also governance structure that would facilitate this process. And of course, we cannot forget about financial and technological support that is also critical for adaptation implementation, as we know that the amounts of investments that are needed, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but on a global scale for adaptation is quite large. So that's another enabling factor to take into consideration. Here in this image now, we see the importance of decision makers in adaptation planning, because they play a pivotal role in this iterative process for planning, implementing, monitoring, reporting, and updating. And such decisions should rely on this robust system of data collection to analyze the climate risks and the underlying contextual, socioeconomic, and environmental factors that would then enable this informed, effective, and efficient selection of adaptation responses for the transformational change that is necessary. While decision makers are critical, successful adaptation planning, however, not only depends on governments, but also on the active and sustained engagement of all types of stakeholders, including local communities, national, regional, and multilateral and international organizations, the public and private sector, civil society, and other relevant actors. So this is especially pertinent in efforts to align and integrate climate change adaptation planning between the different sectors and between the different levels of government, and also between planning, implementation, and financing. Once more, as shown as this figure, decision makers therefore play a fundamental role in bridging the gaps, as we see here in number 1, in bridging the gaps between the interests and the priorities and concerns of stakeholders with the science, the data, and the knowledge that we have about climate change, This is, of course, linked to the national transparency system, and using all of this information then to develop this robust understanding of the current and the projected impacts posed by climate change and the underlying factors that determine the vulnerability of the nation against these impacts, which then allows the effective planning of adaptation through this iterative cycle of management processes to use the information for continuous assessment and adjustment of adaptation efforts. So central to the adaptation planning framework are national adaptation plans. These were established under the Cancun Adaptation Framework at the Conference of Parties, or the COP16, back in 2010. And the NAPs, as we call them, or the National Adaptation Plans, really are this means of identifying the medium and long-term adaptation needs for reducing vulnerabilities and enhancing resilience through the development and implementation of strategies and programs for addressing these needs. So the objectives of NAPs are to reduce vulnerability and to facilitate this integration of climate change adaptation into development planning processes. So again, linked to the presentation earlier today, NAPs are fundamental to support the mainstreaming process. And at the COP17 in Durban back in 2011 was when the NAP process was introduced, really to help facilitate countries in undertaking the necessary steps, arrangements, and enabling conditions to prepare, implement, monitor, and then update their NAPs. So the NAP process is an approach to fully consider climate change adaptation concerns in planning and decision-making processes. It's a mechanism to identify the priority adaptation measures and all the arrangements necessary to generate the information to support decision-making processes, really taking a holistic process that shifts from a project-by-project basis of adaptation action towards a medium and long-term vision, which is particularly important because the vulnerability assessment and climate change impacts typically are projected, to 2050, 2017, 2100. And so this medium and long-term framework within the NAP process helps us capture this long-term vision that's necessary for adaptation planning. So it's critical to highlight that the NAP process is non-prescriptive. That is, there's no one single set way to undertake adaptation planning, and that's fundamental of the NAP process, which is rather underscored by the set of guiding principles that then support countries to undertake adaptation based on national circumstances. So under these principles, the NAP process should foster enhanced action on adaptation in accordance with the UNFCCC, of course, and it should then follow a country-driven, gender-sensitive, and participatory and fully transparent approach that takes into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems. And all of these considerations should be based on and guided by the best available science. So again, the national transparency system comes in play as a critical source of information for the NAP process as well, not only for reporting processes. And as appropriate, the NAP process should take upon traditional and indigenous knowledge and use a gender-sensitive approach. In addition, the NAP process should not result in duplication of efforts that are undertaken in country, but should rather facilitate action and build upon the momentum that has already taken place. With this in mind, the least developed countries expert group developed the technical guidelines for the NAP process, which consist of 4 elements and 17 steps embedded within these elements. They highlight once again that there's no single approach for adaptation planning. Flexibility is key, and that the number and arrangements of these elements and steps should be defined for the country's context. So here in this figure, we observe how the 4 elements and 17 steps of the NAP process come into play and how these interact with each other. First of all, we have element A, which is laying the groundwork and addressing the gaps. Under the first step, we really look at establishing the coordination mechanisms for adaptation planning. Once these are in place, we look at stock taking of all the stakeholders, ongoing efforts for adaptation and development in the country, and assessing capacities for adaptation planning. The third step, we then build upon the capacities and secure support if needed to actually undertake adaptation planning. And on number 4 step, we align adaptation with development. Once this groundwork is laid upon, we move on to the preparatory elements, or element B, which involves first assessing the climate change impacts and the climate change scenarios. Then with these information, we look at the vulnerabilities of the country against the climate change impacts and identify climate change adaptation options. Then we review and compile the national adaptation plans and mainstream adaptation into development planning. Under element C, we can look at the prioritization of the different adaptation options that were identified and promoting really coordination and synergies. And finally, under element D, we look at reporting, monitoring, and reviewing. So monitoring refers to the ongoing collection of information on the implementation progress of the NAP and also the vulnerability indicators that are associated with it. Under the review, we assess the indicators through the strengths, weaknesses, and best practices. And of course, after reporting to various entities, both within the nation or internationally, such as through adaptation communications, through national communications, or the upcoming biennial transparency reports under the Paris Agreement, we can prepare for the update of the next generation or the next version of the NAP. To put this into perspective, I want to highlight that Trinidad and Tobago has already recognized and implemented many of the NAP process elements and steps very effectively, and has submitted its first national adaptation plan earlier in May this year to the UNFCCC, which has really built upon an ongoing work for several years of stakeholder engagement and adaptation planning already in place in the country. So won't take too much time with this, just skimming over how the NAP process looked at in Trinidad and Tobago. Starting since 2011, Trinidad and Tobago established the spearheading coordinated entity for the NAP process. Between 2014 up to 2021, the country was able to access international support through various projects and initiatives to advance the different components of the NAP process as part of element A. Under element B, since 2019, all the preparatory elements were undertaken, including vulnerability assessments, capacity assessments, stakeholder consultations, and then drafting the first national adaptation plan based on different adaptation options and its prioritization. In 2021 as well, implementation strategies under element C were undertaken through strengthened institutional and regulatory frameworks and the development of different prioritization criteria to set a timeline of gradual implementation of various adaptation efforts. And finally, under element D, in 2021, there was a review cycle was also established for the NAP for its future update, including an improvement plan. And of course, in 2024, So earlier this year, the first NAP was submitted to UNFCCC. Just highlighting here, you might all already be familiar with the National Adaptation Plan of Trinidad and Tobago, which really established a vision of a climate resilient nation that routinely evaluates and reduces its physical, social, and economic vulnerability through timely, cost-effective, and adaptation measures. So what I want to underscore here is that some of the objectives of the NAP in Trinidad and Tobago is understanding the national development context, enhancing existing capacities, defining adaptation governments, and ensuring that adaptation pathways are sustainable and cost efficient. And one of the principles that of the NAP process was to prioritize no regret, low regret, or win-win strategies, which we'll look at further down this presentation, what these types of strategies need, but also highlighting that once the NAP was developed, a series of indicators were also prepared under priority sectors for adaptation, including agriculture, water resources, health, and also for Tobago, to help monitor the implementation progress. So I'll combine 33 indicators to not only facilitate reporting under the future BTRs, but also to help monitor and subsequently update the NAP in future editions. So with this in mind, let's go over some key considerations for adaptation planning, starting off with acquiring quality data for informed decision-making processes. Now, the Paris Agreement identifies that strengthening scientific knowledge on climate, including research, systematic observation, and early warning systems, are critical to support decision-making processes. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, also calls for solutions for adaptation to be based on knowledge on current and expected future climate conditions. So these international bodies and agreements highlight the importance of acquiring quality data in the adaptation planning process, and also keeping in mind that climate science continuously evolves based on new research. So to be relevant for policy making, the scientific process must continuously be informed by local knowledge that is continuously updated. Climate science is relevant in adaptation planning in at least 3 ways. So first of all, it provides key knowledge for informed selection of transformative climate action. It also promotes effective implementation of climate actions and increases the likelihood of these actions to achieve their intended results. And the evidence-based approach then facilitates a country's access to finance by increasing the confidence between the public and the private funders, or local and international funders, that the expected successes of adaptation planning is actually backed up by evidence and actually targets the potential risks that have been identified. So some key activities include mapping data sources, of course, related to climate change and socioeconomic determinants for vulnerabilities, and conducting gap analysis on data availability and quality, and planning how to address these barriers. In fact, in cases where the quality or the adequacy of data is limited, some approaches that can be considered is using extrapolated information from neighboring areas or neighboring countries with similar conditions, or using high-quality peer-reviewed analysis or regional models instead of national models to help, bridge the gap on climate science and still be able to use evidence for adaptation planning. And now the choice of approach, of course, depends on the national circumstances. And at this stage, it's also important to collect a stock data of existing adaptation efforts to ensure that adaptation planning builds upon existing efforts in the country. The The second consideration is identifying and prioritizing these adaptation measures. As with all planning processes, adaptation planning is based against numerous needs and concerns to be addressed with a limited number of resources. So first, it's important to identify climate change impacts for which adaptation measures should be developed, then identify the possible adaptation measures for each impact, and finally, ranking and prioritizing these adaptation measures. One of the most critical steps then in adaptation planning is to identify the extent and implications of climate change based on climate scenarios. Based on this information or regional or national models of the expected changes in climate, we can identify first the probability in which a particular dimension of climate change, let's say droughts, heat waves, torrential rains, or sea level rise, for example, may occur. Then knowing this probability, we can look at the likelihood of the impact that these changes would cause. So for example, increased flooding, spread of wildfires, spread of diseases, coastal flooding as well, saltwater intrusion can be another one. And then we map out the magnitude of the consequence of such impacts. So for example, the number of lives that are impacted, economic losses, or loss in agricultural productivity, etc. And so we can identify those impacts, such as those in red, that are high priority for which adaptation measures should be developed, and those for which might not need so much efforts. Here's just a quick case study of the prioritization that was conducted in Trinidad's National Adaptation Plan, for which climate change-related hazards such as flooding, cyclones, and landslide were identified as the top 3 hazards for the country. There are many different approaches for identifying possible adaptation measures, including a hazards-based approach, risk management approach, looking at vulnerabilities, or looking at ecosystem-based adaptation and expert-based approaches. In terms of ranking and prioritizing measures, we can look at the timing or the urgency of the action, other factors such as co-benefits, flexibility, costs, technological feasibility, also social and political acceptance, and alignment with other goals, among other factors. There are many efforts or many approaches to be able to rank and prioritize, including stakeholder consultations, nominal group methods or small questionnaire-based styles, cost-benefit analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis as well, or multi-criteria analysis. Engaging high-level decision makers are also critical. I won't spend too much time here as we looked at that earlier today, but noting that all levels of government, from heads of state, political parties, parliament, judicial systems, financing, and National Statistics Office all have a critical role in providing information, but also interpreting results for adaptation planning. And the last enabling condition is managing uncertainties. It's important to recognize that adaptation planning takes a preventative approach against projected changes in climate, for which there's a lot of uncertainty in the information that's available to take this preventative action. So there's uncertainties such as measurement errors in the projections, natural variability in climate, or uncertainty in future development pathways in a country and future GHG emissions trajectories on a global scale that dictate the extent to which climate change will be implemented. So to manage these uncertainties, there are these low regret options or win-win options that yield benefits from climate change adaptation, so socioeconomic benefits that even though the expected climate change impact does not take place, there is much lower risk and much higher benefits compared to the risks of inaction. Other ways to address uncertainty include soft options, so non-physical but rather capacity building actions, and also implementing reversible options that enable amendments and return to original conditions. The last component of this presentation refers to the alignment of adaptation, sustainability, and disaster risks. So again, that means identifying synergies and trade-offs between these three components. What we note here is that adaptation planning is closely related to sustainable development, as we looked at earlier this morning, but also climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction are also closely linked because they help governments and communities adapt to weather-related impacts. So climate change adaptation focuses more on the process of adjusting to the slow onset and acute climate change and its effects, while disaster risk reduction prevents new and reduces existing disaster risk. And so addressing climate change risks under disaster risk reduction is one of the components of climate change adaptation. But of course, climate change adaptation extends further by also looking at the slow onset events. And this graphics just illustrates these relationships between the three global agendas related to adaptation. So more precisely, the sustainable development acknowledges that climate change undermines sustainable development, whereas the Paris Agreement recognizes the close link of climate action and sustainable development. Likewise, the sustainable development goals include disaster risk reduction targets, which also recognize that sustainable development is necessary for disaster risk reduction. And as well, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction recognizes that climate change is a driver of disaster risk. So there needs to be a close interaction between climate change adaptation and the disaster risk management under aligned efforts. And finally, to conclude, again, as reiterated throughout this presentation or throughout today, there is no prescriptive approach for adaptation planning, but it all comes down to really identifying actors that are interested in aligning adaptation planning, deciding which agendas to align, and deciding the degree of alignment, articulating the outcome, and actually initiating the alignment process. Thank you so much, and happy to address any questions either on adaptation or as later on for mitigation. Thank you.